The evening air in Melvindale, Michigan, often carries the heavy, industrial scent of the nearby refineries, a constant reminder of the blue-collar grit that defines this small enclave on the edge of Detroit. On a night that should have been defined by the quiet rhythm of suburban patrol, the flashing overhead lights of a police cruiser slice through the darkness, signaling the start of an encounter that would eventually pull back the curtain on a decade of systemic violence. Officer Mark Furman, a veteran of the force, stepped out of his vehicle with a posture that projected more than just authority. It radiated a predatory anticipation. The driver he pulled over was an ordinary citizen, caught in the web of a routine traffic stop that, under normal circumstances, would have resulted in a warning or a simple citation. However, within the microcosm of Melvindale law enforcement during Furman's tenure, no encounter was ever truly routine. As the officer approached the window, the dialogue did not begin with a polite request for identification, but rather with a sharp, demeaning command designed to provoke a reaction. This is the hallmark of the escalation phase, where an officer intentionally increases the tension of a situation to create a pretext for physical intervention. In this specific instance, the civilians' confusion was interpreted as defiance, and their natural physiological response to fear, a slight trembling of the hands, or a stuttered question, was recorded in the officer's mind as the first signs of active resistance. The air became electric with a manufactured danger as Furman moved from verbal commands to physical positioning, closing the distance in a way that left the driver with no psychological room to breathe, setting the stage for a catastrophic application of force. When we peel back the layers of such an encounter, we must confront the harrowing reality of what the use of force looks like when it transitions from a tool of control to an instrument of torture. In the legal and ethical framework of policing, force is intended to be the minimum amount of physical exertion necessary to overcome a subject's resistance and ensure safety. However, the analysis of Furman's actions reveals a disturbing deviation from this standard. When a human body is subjected to repeated high-voltage shocks from a taser in drive-stun mode, where the device is pressed directly against the skin to cause intense localized pain rather than neuromuscular incapacitation, the experience transcends mere arrest procedure. It becomes a form of physical torment designed to break the will of the individual. The screams of the victim are not heard as cries for mercy, but are dismissed as the noise of a non-compliant combatant. This shift in perspective is critical to understanding the psychology of misconduct. The officer stops seeing a citizen with constitutional rights and starts seeing a target that must be subdued at any cost. This is the reality of torture within domestic policing. The use of state-sanctioned equipment to inflict maximum pain for the purpose of punishment or personal satisfaction, often justified after the fact by a narrative of necessity that ignores the biological reality of the victim's suffering. To understand how these acts of violence are shielded from immediate accountability, one must examine the police report, which frequently functions more as a work of creative fiction than a factual record. In the case of Mark Furman and many others like him, 5 specific lies consistently appear in the documentation to sanitize the use of excessive force. The first lie is the bladed stance, a phrase used to suggest that the citizen took a combative, martial arts-style posture to justify a preemptive strike. The second is the furtive movement toward the waistband, a classic trope that implies the presence of a hidden weapon, even when the victim is wearing form-fitting clothing or is clearly unarmed. The third lie is the active resistance claim, which often describes the involuntary muscle spasms caused by a taser or the natural human instinct to shield one's face from punches as a deliberate attempt to fight the officer. The fourth lie involves the "feared for my safety" incantation, a magic phrase intended to trigger the protections of qualified immunity by appealing to the subjective state of the officer's mind rather than the objective reality of the threat. Finally, the fifth lie is the contradictory command trap, where an officer shouts, "Don't move," and "Get on the ground," simultaneously, then uses the victim's inevitable failure to comply with both at once as a justification for further violence. These reports are carefully constructed to pass the initial scrutiny of supervisors and prosecutors, creating a paper shield that can take years of litigation to pierce. The legal yardstick used to measure these actions is the landmark Supreme Court case of Graham versus Connor, decided in 1989. This case established the objective reasonableness standard, which dictates that an officer's use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. While this standard was intended to protect officers making split-second decisions in high-stress environments, it has often been misinterpreted as a blank check for aggression. In the context of the Melvindale incidents, the Graham standard requires us to ask, would a reasonable officer facing an unarmed citizen in a routine traffic stop believe that multiple taser deployments and physical strikes were necessary? The court's three-pronged test, considering the severity of the crime, the immediacy of the threat, and whether the suspect is actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest, should have acted as a barrier to Furman's behavior. Instead, through the manipulation of facts in police reports, the reality of these encounters was distorted to fit the Graham framework, allowing systemic abuse to continue under the guise of reasonable law enforcement. Further refining the legal boundaries of force is the case of Bryan v. McPherson, a critical precedent concerning the use of electronic control weapons. In this landmark ruling, the court clarified that the use of a taser constitutes an intermediate, significant level of force that must be justified by a proportional threat. It explicitly stated that tasers should not be used on individuals who are non-compliant but do not pose an immediate danger to the officer or the public. For the citizens of Melvindale, this ruling should have provided a layer of protection against the compliance through pain tactics employed by Mark Furman. The Bryan v. McPherson case highlights the distinction between a passive resistor, someone who simply refuses to move, and an active threat. When Furman utilized his taser on individuals who were merely questioning his authority or standing their ground without violence, he was not only violating department policy, but also flouting federal judicial precedents that recognized the profound physical and psychological impact of being electrocuted by the state. The tragedy of the Melvindale situation is that Mark Furman's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a 14-year pattern of systemic abuse. For over a decade, complaints from citizens had been piling up in internal affairs folders, documenting a consistent history of aggression, intimidation, and illegal force. A pattern like this does not exist in a vacuum. It requires a culture of silence and a failure of leadership. When an officer is allowed to rack up dozens of use-of-force reports without meaningful intervention, the message to the rest of the department is clear. This behavior is acceptable, or at least it will be tolerated. This systemic failure created a protected class within the force, where an officer's seniority and reputation for being tough on crime outweighed the constitutional rights of the people they were sworn to serve. The long-term impact of this pattern is the total erosion of trust between the community and the police, turning the neighborhood into a territory to be occupied rather than a community to be protected. The persistence of such misconduct also has a profound economic dimension that is often overlooked. When a city like Melvindale is forced to pay out millions of dollars in settlements to the victims of police brutality, the money does not come from the officer's pocket or the department's budget. It comes from the taxpayers. This misconduct tax drains resources away from schools, parks, and infrastructure, effectively forcing the victims of police violence to subsidize the very system that harmed them. Furthermore, the economics of protection are bolstered by the influence of powerful unions and the legal doctrine of qualified immunity, which makes it nearly impossible to hold individual officers financially responsible for their actions. This lack of personal financial stakes removes a significant deterrent to misconduct, as officers know that the municipality, and by extension, the citizens, will ultimately foot the bill for their aggression. The financial cost of Mark Furman's career is a staggering figure that represents a massive transfer of public wealth into the hands of those seeking redress for violated rights. One of the most harrowing examples of this systemic failure was the incident involving Alicia Cook. Her encounter with Mark Furman serves as a visceral case study in the dynamics of unchecked power. Cook, a woman who found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, was subjected to a level of physical assault that shocked even those familiar with Furman's reputation. The details of the encounter, the physical manhandling, the total disregard for her safety, and the subsequent attempt to frame her actions as a threat, reveal a chilling lack of empathy. In the aftermath of the assault, Cook was left not only with physical injuries, but with the deep psychological trauma that comes from being attacked by a person wearing a badge. Her story became a rallying cry for those seeking accountability in Melvindale, as it provided undeniable evidence that Furman's violence was not limited to dangerous criminals, but could be directed at anyone who dared to question his absolute control over the street. The momentum for change finally reached a breaking point, leading to criminal charges and a long overdue sense of final accountability. The process of bringing an officer to trial is fraught with obstacles, as prosecutors often rely on the very same police departments for evidence and testimony. However, the sheer volume of evidence against Furman, combined with the bravery of victims like Alicia Cook, who refused to be silenced, eventually made the situation untenable for the city. The criminal proceedings offered a rare glimpse into the internal mechanics of a department that had protected a problem officer for far too long. When the verdict was finally read, it served as a vindication for the many citizens whose complaints had been ignored for 14 years. While a single conviction cannot undo a decade of trauma or fix a broken system, it represents a necessary first step in demonstrating that the badge is not a license for brutality, and that even the most protected officers are ultimately subject to the laws of the land. In light of these events, it is essential for citizens to equip themselves with practical strategies for protection during encounters with law enforcement. The first step is the strategic use of technology. Always record the interaction. In the age of smartphones, the camera is the most powerful tool for ensuring that the police reporter's fiction does not become the final word on the encounter. If you cannot record yourself, narrate your actions loudly so that bystanders or dashcams can pick up the audio. Second, practice the art of tactical de-escalation on your own behalf. This means keeping your hands visible, moving slowly, and providing verbal cues for every movement you make, such as saying, "I am reaching for my wallet in my back pocket now." Third, know your rights, but do not argue them on the side of the road. The street is a place of absolute power for the officer. The courtroom is where the law resides. If an order is unlawful, comply as safely as possible and save the challenge for a legal venue. Fourth, identify witnesses immediately. If others are watching, try to memorize their faces or call out to them to keep watching. Finally, seek medical attention and legal counsel immediately after any use of force. Documenting injuries with professional medical photos and reports is the only way to build a case that can overcome the objective reasonableness defense. These 5 steps do not guarantee safety, but they provide the essential foundation for accountability in a system that for too long allowed men like Mark Fuhrman to operate without consequence. The story of Melvindale is a cautionary tale of how easily authority can curdle into tyranny when left unmonitored, and it serves as a reminder that the price of liberty is, and always will be, eternal vigilance on the part of the citizenry, through the combination of legal precedents, community awareness, and the refusal to accept the 5 lies of the police report. The path toward a more just and transparent system of law enforcement can finally be paved, ensuring that the industrial air of Michigan towns carries the scent of progress rather than the shadow of fear.